Okay, this is the second part of the lecture on industrialization and class war and Marx's analysis of capitalism. And in the first lecture, to recap, we essentially saw how the nation state created by the French Revolution um, proved itself subject to uh, increasing internal conflict in the definition of uh, who are the people and who can think for the people. And I ended by saying that it's Marx who essentially saw the reason as to why the French Revolution and then all of the other national revolutions descended into authoritarian rule ultimately, as being explained by class warfare, right? The idea that the nation state is actually the creation of capitalism and the coming to rule in political terms of a capitalist society, and that such a society will inevitably be defined by class war, and so cannot be maintained on a democratic basis, but is bound ultimately to end in authoritarian rule to be able to maintain capitalism. And for Marx, why that kind of a society, this is what we're going to talk about now. Marx talks about why that kind of a society of class war in the context of industrial capitalism, is bound ultimately to collapse altogether and will be replaced by a very different kind of society, a communist society. So, what we're going to be doing in this second part of the lecture is now actually engaging with Marx, who is writing precisely in this moment in 1848, where there are these national revolutions in which the bourgeoisie and the working people, actually, the bourgeoisie in this case now meaning capitalists, no longer those the third estate of those towns, right? Now we're talking about the people of property, and property meaning capital in the sense of property that's about exchange and profit and growth, right? Um, how the bourgeoisie and the workers who only have their labor to sell, how they make these revolutions against the dynastic order, right? How they make revolutions together, and then how those revolutions dissolve basically because of their class conflict. Um, that's where we were last time. And now we're going to actually go through and discuss Marx's analysis of capitalism and this inevitable class conflict between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat that it leads to, and why something like a nation state will never, of the idea of a rule by the people, will never actually be stabilized in the context of what it actually, in his eyes, leads to, which is class conflict, right? In capitalism. Okay, I'm giving you, this is a picture actually of a Chartist gathering, of a working class gathering in England. And as I hope most of you know, the Industrial Revolution, as historians refer to it in retrospect, the Industrial Revolution first happens in Britain, in England. And just as the French Revolution set out essentially the models for uh, governance and the ways of thinking about identity as national identity in the modern world. The Industrial Revolution in England comes to define what the mode of production, how we produce things and distribute things in our world, right? So this is why they're often referred to as a dual revolution: the industrial revolution in England, the political revolution that creates a nation state um, in France. And the idea is that these two things actually go together. This is Marx's argument in any case, right? That the industrial revolution that consolidates capitalism and that capitalism brings about has its ideological underpinnings, its model of what government should be, right? This idea of the market as a meritocracy, what we talked about when we talked about Sieyès, right? That it has its political ideology as represented in the French Revolution and its reality as a mode of production in the Industrial Revolution, first in England, which obviously then spreads throughout Europe and then eventually all throughout the world. When we start talking about Marx, um, as I'm sure you're all aware, Marx is one of the most controversial thinkers to this day in our own time. Um, and for many people, he's a hero, a prophet. For probably in today's world, many, many more. He's uh, a manipulative, evil thinker, even who's responsible for genocides and so much that has gone wrong in our world in the past 2 centuries, right? Um, what I want to do is I want to give you a chance to understand Marx not through the prism of um, our experience of communism, right? Which is how usually people see Marx. They say, well, people tried this out. People tried out Marx's idea of communism, and it was a horrendous experience, right? These one party states that, in the case of the Soviet Union, killed so many of their own people, essentially, in a totalitarian state. This is how Hannah Arendt, whom we're going to read next week, refers to it, right? Um, that's how Marx is very often seen through the prism of our experience of communism, right? Communism as a system uh, of around the world of states that actually um, commit themselves to Marx's ideology and what Marx says about the world. They call themselves communists. They take on the mantle of Marx and his analysis of capitalism. And so naturally, Marx is very, very often seen through the prism of the experiences that we've had with those kinds of states. And no doubt that experience has been, for the most part, a disastrous one. Um, although I will not in these lectures, but when we talk about it in class, I will try to make clear in a way why Marx's ideas went in the direction of the kind of communism that we've actually experienced. But for the lectures, for trying to understand Marx, I want to give you a different perspective on Marx because uh, when you've read the Communist Manifesto, which I hope that you already have, and if you don't have the texts with you, the Estranged Labor um, and from the philosophical manuscripts and the Communist Manifesto, please stop the video now, go get those readings, and come with them because I'm not going to, again, like the last lectures, I don't have everything that I'm going to cite and read to you. I don't have it written on PowerPoint. So make sure you have those readings. But when you read the Communist Manifesto, you should notice that Marx is actually talking about two great revolutions in the Communist Manifesto. One is the bourgeois revolution, the capitalist revolution, and that takes up much of the text. And that's the one we are actually going to focus on in our lecture, right? We're going to talk about how Marx actually sees the bourgeoisie, what he thinks their role in history actually has been. And that part of the story, I'm going to try to convince you actually he's quite right about. His historical analysis to this day um, is still what historians like I, when we study the Industrial Revolution and the creation of a modern capitalist mode of production, not completely, but for the most part, the story that he tells is still very much a viable one, right? When it comes to the capitalist revolution, to the bourgeois revolution. And I want to especially focus on, since most people come to the Communist Manifesto thinking that Marx is going to say a lot of nasty things about the bourgeoisie, I want to actually focus your attention um, on why actually Marx sees the bourgeoisie as a truly revolutionary force in human history. Perhaps the most revolutionary force there ever has been or will be, right? So we're going to come to that pretty soon. But next to that revolution, Marx obviously also refers to a coming revolution, the proletarian revolution, the communist revolution. This revolution, we're not going to talk about here as much, although I'm going to tell you why he thinks it's going to happen, what the aftermath of it he thinks it's going to look like. The thing about it, though, is that this revolution has never happened. There's never actually been a working class revolution in the history of the world, right? What we've had, the communist systems that we've had, were not the results of working class revolutions. So Marx's predictions, in a sense, did not come true. Not because communism, as we've experienced it, wasn't great, but because communism, in the way that he thought was going to happen, has never happened, right? Uh, the communist states that we have did not emerge in industrial societies. They didn't emerge in societies that were defined by the division between capitalists on the one hand and the proletariat, the working class on the other hand. Just think about it. Think about where communism as a state system, right, where it emerged in places like Russia, which eventually became the Soviet Union. Um, Russia at the time of the communist of the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917 is a predominantly peasant country. The Bolsheviks, Lenin himself, who creates the Russian Revolution, uh, refers to Russia as a backward country, right? And if you look at where there has been communism in the world, it's generally been in pre industrial societies, right? China, Cuba, right? Everywhere in the world uh, that actually had not industrialized to some extent has been especially subject or was especially subject to the pull of communist systems. Whereas Marx argued that the communist revolution would come first and foremost in the most advanced societies, in the most industrialized societies in the world. He was expecting the revolution in Germany. He was expecting the revolution in England. He was not expecting the revolution in Russia. So, like I said, there really, to this day, there has never been a working class revolution. So part of what we're going to do, and I'm not going to do that in these lectures, I'm going to do that actually during our class time, is very briefly, in a way, explain why did Marx's predictions not come true about the working class revolution he was expecting. What then was the reason for the kind of communism that we've had and experienced in the world? And is there any relevance still to Marx's analysis of capitalism and his critique of capitalism and why he thinks it's going to inevitably fail. Um, is there anything about that critique which is still relevant today? And we're going to have about a half hour probably of material discussing that during our class time tomorrow. But what I want us to do in the time that I have to talk to you about Marx here in these videos is to focus much more on the bourgeois revolution, on the capitalist revolution, right? Now, uh, what I want to start out with is the argument that if you read the Communist Manifesto closely, you'll see that actually it's the bourgeoisie who are the hero of the Communist Manifesto. Um, this is ironic in a sense, because Marx, if you read those first couple of pages of Estranged Labor, when he's talking about political economy and how bourgeois liberal economists have talked about economics until his time, um, what Marx wants to say about how the bourgeoisie think is to say they actually don't acknowledge the amazing role that they have played in human history. Why? They take capitalism, how capitalism functions, right, in terms of competition, trade, exchange, everything as being a subject of transaction in the marketplace, and then everything fundamentally based on property, private property that can be owned and exchanged. The whole purpose of the system being to expand that property, to grow capital and profit as much as humanly possible. Marx says the bourgeoisie and political economy, like the political economy we have in the case of Adam Smith, take that kind of behavior and somehow make it into, well, this is what human society really is like. Remember, Adam Smith talked about the law of supply and demand. That if we just let human beings be themselves, right, this is how they would behave. Because this is fundamentally human psychology is about this. Human beings exchange with each other, they do this naturally. And if you allow them to do that, and then to meet each other's preferences and demands, very soon you will get greater specialization of labor because people will divide off what they're actually good at. And that process will actually lead to ever more productivity and ultimately growth, right? And so for the bourgeois economists and political economy, they in a way have to explain why in all of history human beings were not doing actually what the natural thing to do was, right? They have to explain feudalism and how feudalism worked, right, as somehow going against actually the natural way of doing things, which then, the more we understand ourselves, to use Kant's language, then we come to understand that if we organize our society according to what our human social nature is like, founded on exchange and accumulation and profit, will lead to the greatest productivity for everybody. And what Marx wants to argue is this way of thinking about history is completely wrong-headed. It completely misses what the bourgeoisie themselves actually have accomplished in creating a society based on market exchange, on free trade, on market competition, on accumulation, on growth, on profit, on capital. That is completely unprecedented, that had not existed ever in the history of humanity beforehand. And you see, in a sense, why I'm telling you that Marx was not quite wrong about what he was talking about when he talked about the capitalist revolution, because that is also how I've tried to explain things to you talking about a society in which there really was very little market exchange. There were no markets. Um, People lived according to defined roles which they essentially accepted rather than thinking that they were going to make as much profit and money essentially as possible. For the most part, the people who did accumulate were the aristocracy who tried to get more land through war, certainly not through exchange, right? So that there was a radical transformation, which I've described to you in lecture 7, so that we arrive actually at a world of markets. And we're going to review and recap that in a moment, right? But so what Marx tries to do at the beginning of the Communist Manifesto, and this is why I hope you read the text carefully, because you'll see that uh, he's actually very full of praise for what the bourgeoisie have done, which never had existed previously in human history. They are the ones who've actually created uh, a world based on market exchange and competition. They're the ones who've created a world where everything is about money, profits, and as a result, they're the ones who've increasingly created a world uh, based on economic growth and based on an international reality of production and distribution. Globalization, we talk about globalization as something contemporary. But if you read the Communist Manifesto, you'll see he's already talking about globalization. That is the work of the bourgeoisie. It's not that this is the nature of human beings, and so we were bound to get there, as Adam Smith would say, or Kant would say. Um, no, this is actually the work of the bourgeoisie in having created a completely new system of production, capitalism. So, to make that case, I'm going to read some key parts of the Communist Manifesto, which you can follow along with me. And they're in the first few pages, actually, of the Communist Manifesto. Um, I'll read it with you. And if you read it, you'll see, well, anybody who just talks about how Marx was just railing on the bourgeoisie and how evil capitalism is, has not really understood Marx, right? Marx says the bourgeoisie historically has played a most revolutionary part. And as opposed to Kant, Marx believes that the only changes in human society are revolutionary ones. For him, Kant's idea that somehow in a society where things are based on one group of people exploiting another group of people, that somehow you could have a consensus about a better way of doing things when there are exploiters benefiting from exploiting others, he thinks that's just nonsensical. If you have exploitation, exploitation is not going to stop except by revolutionary change, by which he means violent social change, right? Uh, and when he says revolutionary, because Kant, like Marx, like Kant, believes that human history is subject to progress, that we are moving towards a perfect society, actually. Inevitably, we're going to move towards a communist society that is a perfect society because he thinks we're making progress and that change can only happen in a revolutionary way. When he says the bourgeoisie have played a most revolutionary part, he's saying something very, very positive about them. So he says, the bourgeoisie, wherever it has got the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, idyllic relations. It has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors, and has left remaining no other nexus between man than naked self interest, than callous cash payment. It has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor, of chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism in the icy water of egotistical calculation. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value, and in place of the numberless indefeasible chartered freedoms, has set up that single unconscionable freedom: free trade. Read this, and you'll see a, a very short summary of some of the things that we've actually been talking about in the last few weeks. What have the bourgeoisie done? They've taken out all of that supposed hierarchy of purpose and value, where the people at the top somehow have special privileges, chartered freedoms, right? That come to them um, through some kind of enthusiasm about God. And we are meant to do this because this is the way the world is, right? The bourgeoisie have thrown all of that aside and said everybody is the same. We are all basically commodities, and we're dealing with commodities in the marketplace. And there's no connection between us except our exchanges, meaning our money, right? No nexus between man and man than naked self interest, than callous cash payment, which means there's nothing left but my simply trying to make as much money as possible. And the only freedom involved then is free trade, the right to make exchanges with whomever I want for whatever reason, to be able to make as much money as possible, right? This is what the bourgeoisie have done. And he says, the bourgeoisie has been the first to show what man's activity can bring about. It has accomplished wonders far surpassing Egyptian pyramids, Roman aqueducts, and Gothic cathedrals. It has conducted expeditions that put in the shade all former exoduses of nations and crusades. Right? Says, look at all the things that supposedly all of the great wonders that we look at in the history of humanity, all of that is nothing as opposed to what we've done, what human beings, what the bourgeoisie have done in this short span in which we've actually allowed for markets and market exchange to become the predominant way of producing and distributing things in countries and increasingly between countries, right? And he'll make that clear in a couple of slides. This paragraph is a very famous part of the Communist Manifesto. I'll read it to you. The bourgeoisie cannot exist without constantly revolutionizing the instruments of production, and thereby the relations of production, and with them the whole relations of society. Conservation of the old modes of production in unaltered form was, on the contrary, the first condition of existence of all earlier industrial classes. Constant revolutionizing of production, uninterrupted disturbance of all social conditions, everlasting uncertainty and agitation distinguish the bourgeois epoch from all earlier ones. All fixed, fast, frozen relations with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions are swept away. All new formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profane, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. Right? Think about this paragraph and what it's saying. Again, uh, isn't it describing perfectly the idea of a society of innovation? When we at IE constantly celebrate this concept of innovation, right? The reason why you have this class with this title, right? It's this paragraph. Uh, until the bourgeoisie, as I've been trying to tell you in this class, um, innovation was not a good thing. This is why conservation of old modes of production was the first condition of existence of all industrial classes. It's the bourgeoisie that have changed that. It's not that they just changed the system one time. They've created a system founded on constant innovation, on constant transformation of production and of consumption, of growth, right? Uh, this is what Marx is saying. And who has done that? It's the bourgeoisie that have done that. And precisely because they've done that, and read this paragraph and think about our world. Marx is still describing something that seems as real, essentially, as the moment that he wrote it in 1848. We live in a world in which, again, generation after generation, the things that we consume, what we look like, what we eat, is constantly being transformed, right? Uh, and that, for Marx, is the work of the bourgeoisie. He says the bourgeoisie has subjected the country to the rule of the towns. It has created enormous cities, has greatly increased the urban population as compared with the rural, and has thus rescued a considerable part of the population from the idiocy of rural life. Right? It's the bourgeoisie which, through the creation of increasing market dynamics that have put everybody in touch with everybody else, has taken people out of all of those sheltered lives that they had in those very, very localized contexts, whether they be villages or towns. That's why the idiocy that went with not knowing anything of the larger world increasingly has disappeared as the bourgeoisie has created a world based on markets that first were um, statewide. Remember, I said that's what those absolutist states did. They try to create a unified market within their own territory. And then with Adam Smith and the ideal of capitalism itself, increasingly the market can never be kept within one sphere. It increasingly becomes international and ultimately global, right? So that's what the bourgeoisie have done by creating an increasingly globalized world and taking people out of their sheltered environments. And they've taken away the idiocy that comes from not knowing anything about the bigger world than the very, very small world that you inhabit. The bourgeoisie, during its rule of scarce 100 years, has created more massive and more colossal productive forces than have all preceding generations together. Subjection of nature's forces to man, machinery, application of chemistry to industry and agriculture, steam navigation, railways, electric telegraphs, clearing of whole continents for cultivation, canalization of rivers, whole populations conjured out of the ground. What earlier century had even a presentiment that such productive forces slumbered in the lap of social labor? And now you see here you have this description of why it is that this world in which is now being industrialized has created wonders far surpassing anything humanity had created until this point, according to Marx. And again, all of that is the work of the bourgeoisie. And how has the bourgeoisie done that? That is what we have been in some ways talking about in the context of the course over the last 3 or 4 lectures, essentially. Um, we talked about how the idea of property itself changed as we moved from uh, a feudal system where there was a hierarchy of specialization of labor, and those specializations were fixed, right? With the church and the role that it had as the intermediary between human beings and God, with God through the church defining where everybody is supposed to be, the aristocracy as the warrior class that had a monopoly on violence in the society and on arms, usually, the third estate, those people, the artisans, the professional, the craftspeople who practice their own professions and their arts in the towns, right? Each profession and each occupation determining essentially its own affairs on a local basis, and according to an ideal of how something should or should not be produced, right? And then the vast majority of people, the peasantry, who actually worked the land and provided food, and provided just enough of a surplus to be able to support what was not more than 15 or 20% of the rest of the population maximum, which was why it was a society in which scarcity was a huge problem. Because if something went wrong with harvest, then famine would actually hit everybody in the society. So it was a society, again, which property was not about exchange and uh, certainly not about profit, um, and about growth only in the sense of conquest through war and violence, right? Property was what defined people. Property was not something that they exchanged. The aristocrats, the property that they had was their title, right? Property determined who you were. You didn't exchange the land that made you who you are. Um, it, the serfs in the medieval period, the peasants were even tied to the land, right? They didn't even have the freedom to leave the land. And even if someone moved the land from one person to another person, they went with the land. Um, Again, all of those people in the third estate, their production of goods and the services that they provided, those were not done according to a market logic. They were done according to a defined idea of what is the right way of doing things that should be maintained, right? Everything was, as Marx says, about the conservation of an ideal of order and of purpose and what each person's role is supposed to be in the society. And what did the bourgeoisie do to completely, radically transform that reality? They moved out of those localized contexts, right, of the towns. Um, and they were the ones who became the bureaucrats of those centralizing kingdoms and then early modern states of the police states, right? Uh, the the servants of those states, the civil servants, the bureaucrats of those states are generally taken from the bourgeoisie. That's why they come to identify themselves with the state and ultimately to see the purpose of the state as coming from them rather than somehow coming from the state itself. That's the social contract. Um, the bourgeoisie move out of that kind of guild localized production, and they are allowed actually to compete with the guilds. So uh, they are able to go and to hire people in the countryside. Once those barriers between those towns are increasingly taken away by states, and so there's the possibility actually of producing for demand rather than defining what the demand is within a guild. The bourgeoisie are the ones who move out of the simple town confines, um, and they pay the peasantry to produce for them. They are the ones who break down the task of production into different steps and then follow through those steps. And then they take essentially goods to a market that now can actually function according to the demand that is available to it in it increasingly, right? Um, the bourgeoisie are the ones who engage in that trade that goes beyond simply the territory of the state. They're the ones who go and create all of those companies, like the East India Company, to do trade with the Indies, right? So it's the bourgeoisie that start functioning increasingly according to a market logic, market dynamics. And it's to the extent that that starts happening that what was the old feudal way of thinking about property starts to break down and no longer actually function. Because once you are able actually to have market logic and market dynamics, right? This is what we were talking about when we were talking about Adam Smith. You actually make a growing specialization of labor possible, as opposed to those fixed specializations of labor in which things are not supposed to change and everybody has their role and their purpose and are supposed to maintain it. If you actually create market demand, if you can go and hire peasants and pay them money and break down the process into uh, different smaller parts, and so as a result, you can produce more efficiently, and because those people who are producing those things, the peasantry, increasingly are not producing things for themselves at home and can buy it from the marketplace, and so there is ever greater demand in the marketplace, right? Then you have growing specialization of labor, and the more growing specialization of labor you have, the more productivity you have, which means that you can sell the same things at much lower cost, which means that for the first time you set up the possibility actually of economic growth, right? Rather than a system based on keeping things the same, instead, through the productivity of production, you create a system based on constant growth, more and more and more for the same amount of labor put into the process. That's what Adam Smith was talking about as what the market makes possible to achieve. And Marx completely agrees with that part of Adam Smith's analysis, right? This is what market dynamics for the first time in human history make possible. This is why this is why the bourgeoisie are involved in a constant revolutionizing of production. It's not about one fixed specialization of labor that tells people who they're supposed to be. It's that through the process of exchange, we're constantly redefining what each person does and what is valuable to do, because the growing specialization of labor, each person becoming better and better at this and that part of doing things, means that the whole way in which things are produced is completely transformed. And then as a result, the different things that can be consumed by society are completely transformed. And now it's not that what you produce and what you consume defines who you are. Now it becomes about the logic of the commodity. Remember what I said about sugar, that something may start out as being an elite good that only very few people can have, and through growing specialization of labor and through growing productivity, then that can become something that everybody has, right? So, this is why the bourgeoisie for Marx, uh, I am arguing essentially, are the real heroes. They are the ones who, for the first time in human history, have created these market dynamics and the possibility of growing specialization of labor and of growing productivity through historians, before we talk about an industrial revolution, talk about a commercial revolution, right? So, what does this have to do with industrialization? Well, industrialization is simply uh, the mechanization of labor, which means the growing specialization of labor through the mechanization of labor. Here's the shift between Adam Smith and Marx and industrialization generally, right? When Adam Smith talks about the specialization of labor, he means by breaking down the process of production into smaller and smaller parts, allowing people to become better and better at doing one thing as opposed to another thing, we get growing productivity. So, this is why he says we shouldn't make the person who actually grows food also be responsible for selling it, because we want to get somebody who knows how to grow food as well as possible, and we want somebody who gets to know how to market good as well as possible. We don't want two people to be doing the same things. We want people to specialize and to, this is a notion of specialization as, in a way, growing knowledge, right? The more we specialize, the more each person knows of what it is that they do. And so they get better at doing that. And even though they may not know as much as the other person who specialized in something else, um, through the division of labor, right? We all, the society itself, knows how to do more and more things. And so we become more and more productive ultimately through our specialization of labor and then through our cooperation through that division of labor. Um, to this day, obviously, for example, in the sciences and in many other, so many professions, we're still in that way of thinking about the growing specialization of labor. But what if that knowledge, right, is applied, mechanized in such a way that um, those tasks, those different aspects of the production process can actually be done through machines, can be done through mechanical means rather than human beings actually knowing better and better how to do something, right? That is what happens with industrialization. In industrialization, you get a process where machines come to replace the skills of all of those artisans who've produced things in their workshops in the towns, because you could break down the production process into different tasks, and now you could have machines basically do that. So you still have growing specialization of labor, but now you have it done through machines. And this is what industrialization basically means. So it's the continuation of the market logic, of the commercial logic of growing specialization of labor and productivity, but done through the means of machines and mechanization of labor. This is what, for the first time in human history, allows for sustained economic growth. This is a concept we are going to talk about a good bit, um, certainly in the context of the lectures on Marx and in class on Wednesday, right? Why does Marx value the bourgeoisie so much? It's because he sees them as the class that, for the first time in human history, has made economic growth possible. If you went and you tried to map economic growth over the course of world history, for all of the agricultural part of human history that we've talked about until we got to this point, to industrialization, which happens in England, starts in the 1780s. Until that point, if you tried to draw a line across that graph, it would be basically a flat line. Yes, there would be ups and there would be downs and ups and downs, but the line was essentially flat for the most part. Ever since the 1780s, we've been in the midst of sustained economic growth. This is what the Industrial Revolution basically means, right? Yes, if you look at the curve since the 1780s, it's also had a lot of ups and downs, but it's a squiggly line going upwards, so that if you were to draw a line through it, it would be essentially a linear line upwards. And for Marx, that is the amazing thing that the bourgeoisie has done. And where does this first happen? Like I said, in England, and first with cotton textiles, right? You see this. This is one of the pictures drawn of an early mill or an early factory, right? This is why Marx says it's the bourgeoisie who, for the first time, also create a class that had not existed until this point in human history. Uh, this is the working class. The working class are not peasants. They're the people who, because of the commercialization of agriculture, because it has been made efficient enough so that you can actually have those peasants who are already, in a way, working for merchants in their part time on the land. Now those people could be moved all together into cities and into factories to work with those machines to try to now produce all of those goods that used to be produced by artisans in guilds in the towns. Um, and what is the first thing? What is the first area of the economy that's industrialized? It's textiles and it's cotton cloth, right? And you see, who is the workforce? The workforce is mostly women in this early period of industrialization in cotton mills. Women are about half of the workforce. Children are about half of around a fourth of the workforce, and a quarter of the workforce are actually men. Women had always worked, obviously, in their households, but they're the ones who first become part actually of this new working class. There are many reasons for this, partly because women were thought to be better with their hands and working with textiles in any case, um, but also because they were thought to be more obedient. This was a new kind of work, working with machines, where it wasn't that you could do part. It was very like a machine. Human beings and working machines become like machines themselves, right? A very monotonous kind of work that required a lot of discipline. And so they thought women and children, in a way, would respond better to this discipline than men would. The kind of growth that happens through the industrial revolution, starting with cotton production, it's exactly the kind of growth that makes Marx uh, celebrate the bourgeoisie in the language that he does, right? If you look at uh, the industrialization of cotton production, um, Europeans had bought cotton textiles for the most part from India. That's where they had been produced. But from 1785 to 1850, the amount of cotton that is produced in Britain goes up 50 times. It goes from around 40 million yards in 1785 to more than 2 billion yards in 1850, right? 50 times in a matter of around 75 years, right? Think about that. That's almost doubling every year, right? Um, by 1850, uh, almost half of the exports of Great Britain to other countries is cotton textiles. This is the moment in history where you have this radical shift. Remember, I said the Europeans had generally actually been, when it came to their relationship to other civilizations in the world, even in the early modern period, were generally thought of as being backward, not as somehow the most powerful actors necessarily in history. This had already slowly been changing with the discovery of the Americas and the amount of silver and money that started to come into Europe through the silver taken from the Americas. But It's really in the Industrial Revolution that the terms of trade change in such a way that are still predominant in some ways to this day. This is the moment in which, instead of Europeans buying and going to the East to buy more and more things, now Europeans start to sell more and more things. A great amount of this cotton textile actually goes to India. Why? It is so cheap, right? That's what the productivity and the economic growth makes possible. Marx even says that their low prices are the weapons with which it brings down all Chinese walls, right? And opens the barbarians, as he calls them, uh, to um, uh, to basically the globalization of the marketplace. The second area of the economy that's industrialized are trains. This is why when usually you think of the 19th century and the technological transformation of the 19th century, uh, so many people think increasing very much of trains in novels, trains in paintings, right? So here is what the bourgeoisie has accomplished. They have created a society for the first time in human history based on economic growth. And what is the promise of this? The promise of this is a society beyond scarcity, right? Scarcity had been the problem of human society forever, right? Why couldn't we have the perfect world? We couldn't have the perfect world because there's simply not enough for everybody. Exploitation was not an option. You had to exploit others if you were going to have a great, decent lifestyle. There was no other way. There was simply not enough. But for Marx, what the bourgeoisie actually have done is they have moved human society for the first time through the productivity of industrialization. They've actually moved us for the first time through economic growth beyond scarcity. And Marx thinks once this happens, actually, the whole equation of society, the whole equation even of human psychology is going to change. And that change will come from the fact that having created a society beyond scarcity, the way in which capitalism actually produces and distributes goods cannot sustain the growth that it has actually brought about. So I'm going to stop this lecture here and give you, there's probably about another half-hour lecture um, on Marx. And I'm going to make a separate video for that one.